This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a quick look at today's markets. Now, global markets climbed today. That's after Chinese exports surprised even the bulls, recording strong numbers. We saw MSCI's emerging market stock benchmark index falling 0.2% on the day. It was only dragged down by some developing world bourses, such as South Africa's JSE. Now, the JSE only firmed slightly today, of course, as US-China trade tensions continue to weigh on sentiment, and of course, as investors digest the extent of the impact of coronavirus on the economy. Now, also coming up on today's show. It's only a matter of time before it's the end of South African Airways as we know it. America's unemployment claims hit 33.3 million amid the coronavirus pandemic. And Tunisia's engineers launch a campaign to use 3D printing in the fight against COVID-19. Now, in the next 48 hours, Public Enterprise Minister Pravin Gordhan is set to meet the South African Airways business rescue team in an effort to iron out some of those tensions between the group and the South African government. The government was at loggerheads with the airline, which wants all flights, including those to repatriate stranded South Africans, halted by Friday. Now, SAA was put into business rescue earlier this year. Business rescue practitioners have recommended that it either be liquidated or wound down with all staff retrenched. But the government is intent on seeing a new airline rising from the ashes of SAA. Well, let's get the latest on the airline from CGTN's Angelo Coppola. He joins us in Johannesburg. Angelo, always good to see you. Now, at yesterday's briefing in Parliament, we saw Public Enterprise Minister Pravin Gordhan criticizing the business rescue effort. He said their proposals to wind down South African Airlines was not in line with the original purpose in their brief. So what was his key message to Parliament today? Or yesterday, rather?
Well, the bottom line, Uche, is that he's not impressed with the business rescue practitioners' efforts. In fact, he has some questions concerning their spending in the last 5 months or so. He's also questioned the use of an aviation consultancy, which apparently didn't produce any results that they've seen at the moment. That's the Public Enterprises Department. He says there will be a new national flag carrier. It will be different and leaner, and it will have some private sector involvement, and there will of course still be that government involvement. So it won't be liquidated or shut down as it stands at the moment, but who knows, anything can change in the next 24 hours, Uche.
It is quite uncertain, Angelo, because the business rescue practitioners had put together a proposed termination of an employment agreement for South African Airways staff. And of course, they gave unions the deadline of 8th May to sign that agreement. So where does that leave the BRP's plan and certainly their discussions with unions going forward?
Well, look, as far as it's concerned, originally the 8th of May would see the start of voluntary retrenchment packages, and the 12th of May, that's next Tuesday, would see the start of compulsory retrenchments. The so-called drop-dead deadline is tomorrow, the 8th. It's the subject of a labour court battle at the moment. This was heard in court today. We listened in on that conversation between the opposing sides, that's the BRPs, and the two unions, NUMSA and the South African Cabin Crew Association. So that conversation happened. We expect to hear a decision either later this evening or possibly early this morning. But the unions essentially want to see a plan before agreeing to any form of retrenchment package. The BRPs are saying that the retrenchment package can precede the plan, and there is no plan yet, and that's 5 months into the process. Gordhan says he got a framework from the BRPs yesterday, or in fact on Tuesday. Yeah, that's right, on Tuesday. And in the meantime, the two parties, that's the BRPs and the unions, are talking to each other through their lawyers. But the court decision could change all of that. Uche.
Well, Gordhan will be meeting with the business rescue practitioners, as we mentioned, before the end of this week. Given all this tension in the air between them and the government right now, what are the expectations for that meeting?
Well, look, the government expects the BRPs to stick to the brief that they were given by the Department of Public Enterprises, but it is going to be awkward. The BRPs have been communicating with those interested parties, including the lenders, via letters. The BRPs, of course, would inform the parties of certain actions or certain plans that they were planning to implement, only to have Minister Gordhan issue a statement contradicting or rescinding any of those agreements or announcements. And Gordhan has also been using his parliamentary privilege to air his concerns and make announcements. So the BRPs are in a bit of a difficult position as it stands right now, leaving some to wonder why they haven't actually walked away from what can only be one of the most difficult projects in the country at the moment. Uche.
Now, one interesting thing that Gordhan mentioned in Parliament is that they would make every effort, or they'll take every effort will be made to find a way to reposition South African Airways with private partners. Now, Ethiopian Airlines has been clear that it is open to talks. Are there any possible deals finally in the works?
Which Gordhan said absolutely nothing about the detail, about anybody who might be interested. He did mention that they were talking to some parties. He didn't go into any specifics, but an analyst I spoke to a couple of days ago suggested that anyone who's interested in a stake would look at the more profitable parts of that group. Getting involved in the group as a total would probably be too much to ask, and that's even more so in the current COVID-19 environment. There's no question that it's going to be a buyer's market, of course, as we approach the lifting of local and international travel restrictions. But the challenge, of course, for SAA is that if it starts from scratch, it won't have a track record. It's a work in progress, and buyers may not be that interested in getting involved in a new, so-called new player on the block.
Well, many thanks, Angelo, for your insights. I'm sure you're standing by for tomorrow's decision and you'll be giving us updates. That's Angelo Coppola joining us there in Johannesburg. Well, moving on now, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected nations differently, but there appears to be a common thread throughout, one that was little unexpected, as CGTN's Angelo Coppola now explains.
The pandemic has led to lockdowns and economies almost grinding to a halt in most countries. It's also led to increased innovation.
We expected there to be innovation and, as a consequence, an increase in the development of intellectual property. And we have seen that. There's been a tremendous increase in development of intellectual property. And then we're also seeing a rapid adoption of technology in the retail space. So either current technology being embraced, for example, adoption of off-the-shelf mobile applications.
Retailers have moved quickly because their businesses have almost dried up overnight.
We're seeing retailers developing their own bespoke technology, which not only creates a revenue stream from the products that they're selling, but also a revenue stream from being able to license that technology to other retailers.
Ownership of the intellectual property that's been developed now becomes a grey area.
Now, as retailers start going back, or they contemplate going back, they're going to have to look at what they've developed over the last 6 weeks. And not only the owner of the retail stores, but also their employees, because a lot of those employees have been on unpaid leave. So they need to look very carefully at the ownership of that intellectual property. Is it going to be the retailer that owns it, or do they need to look in a more detailed way as to which employees have developed intellectual property and ensuring that it's actually the retailer that owns that IP.
The challenge during the first phase of the lockdown was that the intellectual property offices were closed. They've since reopened.
They're going to have to try and register their intellectual property now that everything is open again, to make sure that they get registrations. And that is also incredibly important, not only from protecting their products, protecting their brands associated with those products, protecting the inventions related to those products, but also they can generate revenue by licensing that IP to other retailers. And then also, what a lot of people forget is that if they register that IP, they can raise funds by putting that IP up as security.
As businesses start coming back on stream again, it's important that any agreements are actually signed in legal terms, because otherwise people are put at risk and others might take advantage. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Now, Egypt's parliament has approved the government's request to increase revenues. The law includes an increase in some public services. It also imposes fees over fuel and other commodities. CGTN's Adele El Maroui explains.
In a desperate move to manage its widening deficit, the Egyptian government wants to add fees on some commodities and services. It's adding a 10% tithe over professional sports contracts, 2% on concerts and wedding ceremonies, and 5% on mobile phone sales.
Our only reason for accepting the government request is the given circumstance of the coronavirus. There is a slowdown in global trade and economy. Egypt is affected. The government seeks to increase its resources, which will drop in the next fiscal year due to the drop in tax revenues and other resources.
Parliament has approved the government request, which adds up to 20 US cents per kilogram for tobacco. Some members of parliament, though, objected to fees imposed over fuel. The financial ministry wanted 20 cents for every liter of gasoline and 35 cents for diesel.
I saw there was a drop in oil prices globally, which also affected Egypt, so they shouldn't add any fees. But the government claims that consumer prices won't change because there are future drops in prices expected due to the current $22 crude price. The government's current budget has set the price for $67.
Parliament is still negotiating with the government to adjust its expected oil prices in its next fiscal year to range from $45 to $50. Expected revenues increase from fuel fees alone is around $400 million out of the $1 billion this Resources Development Law targets.
There's no need for increasing notary services because that affects average citizens directly. Other aspects like the 25% on imported pet food, that's fine. Some articles are acceptable, but others like fuel are not reasonable. What's more important is that the government supports underprivileged Egyptians in return.
The pandemic has made the Egyptian government try to allocate funds by all means. Each of the articles approved by the parliament might only provide it with fractions, but putting them together, the government may somewhat bridge the gap in the budget deficit. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
And let's now take a look at our corporate headlines. The Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa expects revenue losses of $11 million from April to the end of this month. Now, the ongoing COVID-19 crisis has had an enormous financial impact on PRASA, resulting in further cash constraints on an already strained financial situation. The pandemic is also taking its toll on the state-owned rail agency's project timelines, as well as its capital intervention programs. Meanwhile, the Union Association of South Africa has threatened to block local South African airline Comair's application to go into business rescue. On Tuesday, Comair, which owns Kulala.com and operates British Airways flights locally, said it had no choice but to make the move. That's after its implementation of a turnaround strategy was disrupted by measures to curb COVID-19. And in the meantime, Ethiopian Airlines Group has almost doubled its cargo capacity to help navigate the aviation crisis caused by COVID-19. Africa's biggest airline has converted 11 passenger planes to transport goods, adding to an existing fleet of 10 Boeing Co-777s and 2 737 freighters. It has also added new cargo destinations in South America, China, and Europe. It is also transporting 2 plane loads of cut flowers every day. And finally, British Airways owner International Airlines Group is set to cut up to 12,000 jobs. The announcement came as IAG reported operating losses of $580 $177 million for the first quarter of this year, and that's due to the COVID-19. The airline group has halted 94% of its flights in response to travel restrictions. It is currently planning for a return to service in July at the earliest, at around 50% of its previous capacity. And that is a look at our corporate headlines. Well, we'll be heading now into a short break, but still coming up on the show. We'll be looking at how COVID-19 has impacted transporting goods across East Africa. And tobacco sales are off to a sluggish start in Zimbabwe amid the coronavirus pandemic.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business. Only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra Naidoo. Hello, Naro.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business. Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN. Welcome back to Global Business Africa. Now, the East African bloc is facing some challenges facilitating the transport of goods between member states and simultaneously preventing the spread of the coronavirus amongst long-distance truck drivers in the region. Guidelines issued by the regional bloc have required the testing of all truck drivers at special border points. While the move does help reduce mistrust amongst truck drivers and border officials, the delays and the restrictions are causing some friction between member states. It has also increased the cost of transport between major cities. Stakeholders in the transport sector say they're seeing increases in fuel expenses, mileage per trip, and even truck and cargo security. Now, officials say their aim is to keep border crossings open for freight traffic so that trucks can be cleared as quickly as possible. They now plan to deploy mobile lab clinics at key border points to manage those delays. Of course, East African member states are interlinked at many levels, hence the need to come together and issue regional guidelines. Well, let's find out how stakeholders in the sector are dealing with this. Kobo 360 is one of Africa's leading logistics platforms. We're now joined by the firm's Chief Strategy Officer, Kagure Wamunyu. Great to have you on the show with us, Kagure. Now, you say that this mandatory testing at the borders has reduced clearance for your truck drivers to less than 50% now. So give us an idea of how much of an impact these trade and movement restrictions we've seen have had on your ease of doing business.
So since the COVID-19 pandemic and the coordinated efforts at the borders began, we've actually seen a huge delay in terms of movement of cargo. So looking, for example, at the border between Kenya and Uganda, we are seeing delays up to 48 hours going all the way to 72 hours. The reason being that trucks have to be sprayed, drivers have to be tested, and have to wait for the results to come out. And so the delay definitely is impacting the speed at which people are able to receive the cargo that they are waiting for.
Now, truck drivers are also saying, in the region, are also saying they're seeing an increase in costs. And as you mentioned, lengthy turnaround times. What is the extent of the financial pressure that this has put on your business?
So one of the first things that we saw was that with the increased times for movement of cargo, it meant that there was an increase in terms of freight costs. This cost comes from the number of days that drivers spend on the road. Oftentimes it goes into the driver payout that you actually make. It also means that there are other externalities that you face, and you forego carrying more cargo, bringing up the cost. In general, as a sector, we have taken the route that we're not passing the cost as Kobo 360 to the end user. And the reason is that these delays are not being caused by anybody's fault. It's almost, it is measures that actually have to be taken at the moment to ensure that people, we limit the spread of the disease throughout the East African bloc.
Well, the East African community officials are saying they plan to deploy more mobile lab clinics at key border points in order to, of course, help those delays. Do you think that will help manage the problem? Will it make it any better for logistics firms such as yours? What are your thoughts on those measures? And do you have any suggestions that they can take?
So at the moment, one of the main reason that there is a huge delays is the time it takes to actually get tested and get results as drivers wait at the border before crossing over. So having more testing points would definitely decrease the wait times at the border, because more people are tested, and improvement in the speeds at which they release the results will actually improve this. So definitely having mobile clinics or more testing points would decrease the almost 100-kilometer wait line that we're seeing at the borders. I think definitely one of the measures that would help is the embracing of more technology and technological firms in terms of logistics. So we see this as quite crucial because it reduces the contact points at loading points. So we're seeing there's a huge challenge at loading points where people have to also be tested at the port of Mombasa before taking out the cargo. So using technology may decrease the touch points or the number of times that people have to meet face to face.
Now, as you also mentioned, Kagure, this current situation is unavoidable due to, of course, the coronavirus pandemic. Now, it has hit a number of sectors and changed the way we do business in a number of ways. How do you think this will change the way logistics is done post-coronavirus? What is your outlook for the logistics sector?
So the first thing is in diversification of industries. When this happened, when the pandemic began impacting our countries, we saw that some sectors actually saw a dip in demand, while sectors such as food actually had an increase in demand. And so we'll increasingly see more and more transporters and logisticians diversify in terms of products. The other thing is that this pandemic has presented the need to actually have technology in terms of when you place order for cargo, being able to track cargo. How do you monitor the movement of your trucks without having physical meetings, etc.? And so two things are likely to happen. So diversification, and number two, adoption of technology more widely.
Well, many thanks for your insights, as always, Kagure. That's Kagure Wamunyo. She's a Chief Strategy Officer at Kobo 360. Well, let's move on now. The Executive Board of the International Monetary Fund has approved funding for various nations to respond to the economic shock caused by the coronavirus pandemic. Kenya will receive $739 million. Uganda will receive $481.5 million, while Zimbabwe will get a grant of $7 million. The funds were approved on Wednesday and are expected to help the various nations revive economic growth. The grant to Zimbabwe should help it fight the coronavirus and provide support to the already struggling economy and, of course, its food crisis as well. Zimbabwe is not eligible for debt financing and forgiveness as it's still in arrears of $1.2 billion to the World Bank, the African Development Bank and the European Investment Bank. And heading to Ethiopia now, the government has introduced a stimulus package to keep the private sector running. This will be in form of tax breaks meant to ensure that workers retain their jobs. Well, CGTN's Coletta Wanjoy explores what this new measure means for Africa's second most populous nation.
It is a tough time for Ethiopia's economy.
Ethiopian Airlines, for instance, is reporting a significant amount of loss, about 560 million. Most of the tourism sector is impacted. Exports are dwindling. In fact, in some specific sectors like floriculture, for instance, there is a complete halt in some areas. Of course, there is some recovery lately, but generally, COVID is really affecting our economy.
Privately owned businesses have had to struggle to survive on their own. While many businesses have been forced to shut down, others have adjusted their operations to have their workers work from home, and others have been forced to cut down costs by laying off their workers. In March, the government injected over $450 million as liquidity for private banks to enable them provide debt relief and additional loans to customers. But now it is being forced to do more through tax relief. Outstanding dues between 2015 and 2018 will also be cancelled.
We've created some flexibility for businesses that still have tax liabilities to only pay the principal tax amount, and the council has cancelled interest and penalty on it, and also provided a timeline, a payment plan. They can pay over a year, they can only pay 25% of it.
The government is also using tax incentives to save people from losing their jobs.
In that regard, the government, for instance, has allowed businesses to retain the employee income tax and use it as a salary payment. And also for those businesses that give 2 months rental fee for their tenants, the government has allowed them, made them free of rental property tax.
Firms that are able to pay taxes in a lump sum will enjoy a 10% discount, and in appreciating those that have contributed to the government's cause to combat COVID-19, the companies will be given a 20% discount from their taxes. Apart from depending on its domestic resources to keep the economy afloat, the country has got a recent boost from the International Monetary Fund of $411 million and an assurance that it will.
And merchants adapt to new protocols to contain COVID-19. Tobacco is the second biggest earner of foreign exchange after gold in Zimbabwe. Last year, it generated $747 million in exports, mainly to China and Europe. From Harare, here's CGTN's Farai Mwakutuya with more.
Deliveries in the first week of sales are lower than the same period last year, a reflection of the reduction in the number of growers and hectarage put under the crop last year, but also a result of logistical challenges presented by the coronavirus, which has disrupted transportation and seen sales being conducted under unfamiliar, strict controls. Normally, farmers want to be here in person so they can see for themselves just how much their crop fetches. But because of a need to decongest the sales floor, only farmers with 100 bales or more are allowed to witness the auction. It's left some small-scale growers in the dark.
It's been 3 days since we got here, and we have no idea if our tobacco has been bought or not and for how much. All we have been told is that the payment vouchers are still being processed.
When they do get paid, half of their proceeds will be in US dollars and the balance in local currency.
It's the first time in several years that we'll get half of our money in US dollars. A promise we hope will materialize because it means that we can preserve the value of our money, sustain our families and restock inputs so that we can go back to the field next season.
Tobacco production is projected around 213 million kilograms, which will generate hundreds of millions of US dollars, a crucial injection of liquidity in the wake of a COVID-19 induced economic slowdown. The effects of the pandemic could spill over to the next season.
We are recommending farmers to get prepared for any event, which entails farmers have to have the appropriate protective equipment at the farms. They have to have the sanitizers, they have to have the thermometers, they have to have the mask for their workforce, which is really an additional cost to a already strained farmer, thereby threaten the viability of the farmer.
The extra burden could weigh some of them down, leading to another drop in production and revenue in 2021. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Now, South African wine exports are once again set to resume. The announcement is a breath of fresh air for the industry, whose exports have been restricted for several weeks due to COVID-19. Well, CGTN's Travis Andrews has more on that story from Cape Town.
It's been an unprecedented few weeks for South Africa's wine industry. Not only have they had to deal with the implications of COVID-19, but they've also had to deal with an export ban. It was until now, though, and exports to overseas markets can once again proceed under new regulations. But the industry is trying to pick up the pieces.
With level 4 implementation now and the ability to export, we're very thankful for that. But unfortunately, there's a lot of potential income that's already been lost now, and that they will have to try and recoup over the shorter or the near future now. But unfortunately, it resulted in a huge negative impact on the industry.
According to industry experts, the sector lost over $112 million in revenue across the value chain, much of which is centered in the Western Cape. With 300,000 people employed, securing jobs remains pivotal, including for those tasked with marketing local wines internationally.
The real focus right now is social media and online platforms, doing online tastings. Our producers are being very proactive in terms of engaging with their consumers in international markets to host tastings and fun and interactive sessions, because at the moment that's really all we can do. All our events, our shows, they've all been cancelled for the time being.
With the skies shut, the sector is relying mostly on shipping the wine via the Cape Town port, even though it's operating at just 50%. With low growth in traditional markets like Europe, the Chinese market still remains one of the most important markets for the local industry, and the sector is now doubling down on their efforts to regain their market share.
China is picking up the pieces and back in business, and we hope that our producers can now supply that market with wine, as they've been waiting for quite some time to be restocked with wine. So we will continue all our efforts within the market. Our market manager in Asia, based in Shanghai, is very, very active and very busy, as well as within the Hong Kong market.
There are concerns across the industry that the pandemic may lead to a number of wineries closing down in the country. But with international markets opening up for local producers, it does give them at least some breathing space. Travis Andrews, CGTN, Cape Town.
You are watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a short break. Still to come. America's unemployment claims hit 33.3 million amid the coronavirus pandemic. And a welcome boost to New Zealand's economy as it restarts food exports to China.
Business in Africa is at the crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what what you make happen for yourself. If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
And on to the international front now. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has forced 1 out of every 5 U.S. workers to apply for unemployment benefits. Another 3.2 million Americans filed initial jobless claims last week after factoring in seasonal adjustments. That brings the total to 33.3 million so far. According to the U.S. Department of Labor, however, the latest figure is down from the record 6.9 million for 1 week in March. Some economists say the downward trend is a good sign that things aren't getting worse. Others, on the other hand, argue that millions of new claims each week are not helping the overall picture of the world's biggest economy. And staying in the U.S., where a $349 billion COVID-19 small business stimulus package known as the Paycheck Protection Program ran out of funds in just 2 weeks. Part of the problem was that big businesses got a big chunk of that money. Here's Karina Huber with that story.
The U.S. Congress recently added $310 billion to its Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP. It's meant to offer relief for small businesses amid the COVID-19 outbreak.
The bill is passed.
The first round of small business stimulus in the amount of $349 billion ran out of money in less than 2 weeks.
I personally don't know any other small business owners who has received funding from PPP in D.C.
Much of the money reportedly ended up going to large firms, including hedge funds and publicly traded companies. They included the owner of Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, traded on the NASDAQ. It got $20 million. Potbelly, a chain of sandwich shops, and burger giant Shake Shack each got $10 million, as did salad chain Sweetgreen. Part of the problem is the money was doled out on a first-come, first-served basis, not based on need.
A company that's doing tens of millions or hundreds of millions a year in revenue is going to be first in line with a big bank when it comes time to apply for one of these things. And if you're a little guy, chances are you're going to the back of the line.
4 banks, including J.P. Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo, are being sued by small businesses for allegedly prioritizing applications from big companies because they generate higher fees.
That's what they do. They loan money, and they're supposed to do it according to not only criteria, but according to what we think is right. But if somebody got something that we think is inappropriate, we'll get it back.
The Small Business Administration recently issued an advisory saying if a company cannot prove it was truly eligible for a loan, the money should be returned by May 7th. After considerable criticism, Shake Shack, the company that owns Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, Sweetgreen, and Potbelly all announced they would be returning the $50 million in loans they got from the government. And the Treasury announced hedge funds and private equity do not qualify for the loans. Karina Huber, CGTN, New York.
Now, there are also concerns over meat supplies in the United States. Some major grocery chains are now limiting the amount of meat customers can buy. CGTN's Dan Williams has more from Chicago.
This butcher in Chicago is enjoying some rapid trade. But further down the supply chain, there is pressure on U.S. meat supplies. Over the last month, dozens of meat packing plants across the U.S. have been closed due to COVID-19 outbreaks. Those disruptions are now being felt by consumers. Nearly a fifth of Wendy's restaurants have run out of beef products, according to a report. While some grocery chains, including Costco, have started rationing the amount of meat customers can buy at any one time.
I think it's useful to think about this as an hourglass shape. There are lots of livestock producers, but all those animals have to flow through a small number of very large packing facilities.
Meat packing plants have become a hotspot for COVID-19. The outbreaks forced some to suspend operations. Last week, US President Donald Trump issued an executive order requiring the plants to stay open. Having implemented new safety measures for workers, some are now back online, and some food groups are confident the supply impacts won't last long.
We are very hopeful that we can see that the packing plants will start moving back up to 100% capacity so that we can get more of our hogs to market. That critical point is to help make sure we can make those workers feel safe in their environments, because they are critical to getting our product to the consumers.
The shelves at this butcher in Chicago remain packed full of meat products. Although the owners say they have experienced some slight impacts, they have yet to see the shortages experienced elsewhere.
Yeah, there's been some issues of getting, items regularly. We're still able to get product. It may take a bit longer than it normally would. Now it's like we order something in the evening and it might not be available that day, it might not be able the next day, but it's coming. There's still product out there. Real big ones?
Gepperth Meat Market has been in operation since 1906. The current owner, Otto Demke, believes there is more than enough supplies, so long as people don't buy in bulk and hoard.
If you buy everything that you can see, the person coming in after you won't be able to. It just escalates. You know what I mean? It's a panic thing.
One of the major victims of the meat packing closures are US farmers. With slaughterhouses unable to take the animals, farmers face the prospect of euthanizing them. The farmers, like the restaurants and supermarkets at the other end of the chain, will be hoping the packing facilities can stay virus-free and keep production moving forward. Dan Williams, CGTN, Chicago.
Meanwhile, China's appetite for high-quality food is providing a welcome boost to New Zealand's economy. Now, New Zealand has been hit hard by the closure of its borders in response to COVID-19. Over the past few weeks, though, exporters have reported an increasing demand from China for a wide variety of products.
New Zealand's lucrative rock lobster export industry was stopped in its tracks when China cancelled New Year celebrations in late January. But the May Labor Day holiday has triggered fresh orders for the delicacy.
We're very fortunate. We have a wild-caught lobster species which is recognised in China as the best in the world.
Chinese demand for New Zealand Manuka honey has also soared because of its antibacterial properties and a perception that it can boost immunity.
The demand for Manuka honey coming out of China is strong, and this current situation, it's actually stronger because the Chinese population have always known the values of this honey.
New season kiwi fruit exports to China are also off to a flying start, and beef and sheep meat sales are back to normal after a slump in February and March.
China takes about a third of New Zealand's dairy products, about 40% of our meat, and about 60% of our forestry and wood products. So it's going to be really important in New Zealand's recovery.
Over the past few years, tourism had gradually overtaken dairy farming as New Zealand's biggest export earner. But with our borders suddenly closed to international visitors, the tourism sector has gone from hero to zero, and that means farming has claimed back its traditional reputation as the backbone of the economy. New Zealand's reputation as a world leader in food safety will be a key factor in future success, which is why Manuka honey exporters want a certification trademark in China to prove that their product is trustworthy.
It's about safety. This pandemic has taught us the need of control, of traceability and ensuring safety to the consumer.
And lobster farmers are confident that China trusts their product.
Chinese recognise premium seafood from around the world, but we're very fortunate. We're likely to remain in demand there.
Hopefully the demand for healthy foods like New Zealand's vitamin-rich and low-cholesterol avocados will generate added export revenue.
Natural health and wellness has certainly been an area that's been growing really quickly in China and an area we expect to grow further in the future.
It won't happen overnight, but thanks to farming, the New Zealand economy looks to be on the road to recovery without tourism. Owen Poland, CGTN, Auckland.
Now in Thailand, COVID-19 has severely impacted the economy and job security. Experts say 10 million Thais could fall into unemployment within the next few months. Now lockdowns have left people feeling anxious and worried about their future. prompting some to take matters into their own hands. CGTN's Dusita Sakeo has more from Bangkok.
Before the coronavirus pandemic struck, Natawutsi Mark was an entertainer, a famous one. With more than 100 million views on YouTube, he's one of the most sought-after rappers in the business. But as soon as the stages closed down, the 38-year-old decided to swap the bright lights for the suburban streets of Bangkok. He now stands behind a modest food cart, selling his daughter's favorite food, grilled pork skewers.
From March to April, I've had 50 gigs cancelled because of COVID-19. But I have to live in this moment and with the situation and find something else to do because we don't know when this will end.
He came from humble beginnings. He lives a comfortable life. He now makes a fraction of what he used to, but he is determined to still be the financial pillar of his family, even with this more menial job.
I'm not struggling, but I want to contribute and help the community. I donate some of the profit and give away free food to people with no money. Since I started doing this, I've been enjoying it, so in the future, I will do this as well as performing.
Unexpected events disrupt our habitual routines, jolt us out of our comfort zones. But like Natawut, Thanapon has found a way to adapt. His hotel, Erawan Princess in Kanchanaburi, was forced to close. With more than 20 hotel staff, letting them go was not an option for him, so he put them to work. Utilizing the hotel's empty grounds, they plant and harvest vegetables. Then, Thanapon gets into his pickup truck, takes his staff, and off they go to sell the produce.
It's difficult for the elderly and people in quarantine to travel to the markets, so we drive to them. It's a win-win for both. We sell the produce for a cheap price just to cover our basic costs because everyone is in a difficult situation.
For generations, back-of-a-truck mobile stores were commonplace in Thailand, but the rise of supermarkets drove them out of business. For Thanapon, it's back to basics, as he drives from village to village, providing a service perfect for quarantine life, while also evoking nostalgia for customers buying off display racks.
Shutdowns have triggered a massive tsunami of job losses in Thailand, with experts estimating that 10 million people will lose their jobs if this situation prolongs. Much remains uncertain. Many are stuck in limbo, and with no end in sight, unsure of how they will emerge from the other side. But with challenges come opportunities, taking a leap of faith, adapting to survive. Dusita Sakeo, CGTN, Bangkok, Thailand.
Now, with millions of people around the world stuck at home for months due to the pandemic, many are now taking solace in video games. Esports is fast becoming a popular substitute for traditional sporting matches. Our Grace Lee reports on Grassroots tonight.
Here comes Abed. Ramsey's might want to still do damage. Stun. Ramsey snatches it, and it's a big three-man ulti onto.
I guess for people who are not familiar, it's easier to describe as just basically a sport of teams with 5 players against 5 players.
Andreas Nielsen, known professionally as Crit, is a pro gamer.
Pretty good play.
He's a support player for his team Evil Geniuses, and the online game Dota 2 is their playing field.
We also have a coach, like most sports have a coach, and then we compete against other teams. So in that way, it's very much like traditional sports. The difference obviously being that we have keyboards and mice.
With the coronavirus pandemic keeping people at home, esports, video games, and online streaming have all been seeing an unprecedented rise. Crit streams almost every day, and thousands tune in to watch.
Go, go, go. Chess, chess.
On the one hand, video games are comforting. They're a space of escape, distraction, like a lot of other entertainment media. They're a place where we can kind of turn off the rest of the world a little bit.
According to Lane Nooney, an assistant professor at NYU, gaming can be used as a coping mechanism, but it also offers some almost therapeutic benefits.
I think that one of the things games give us is a way of being together without having to talk about what's imminently going on. We all know why we're in these spaces, or in these spaces more than we have. We know why we're picking up our Switch or our Xbox controller more than we have before. But games give us a place to feel playful again, to feel a little padded against the outside world.
According to analyst estimates, video games have seen a 40 to 60% surge in sales worldwide since the pandemic began. Now, some games have been doing better than others, though. For example, this game, Animal Crossing's New Horizons, sold more than 5 million copies since it was debuted in late March. It's now the fastest-selling console game of all time. However, disruptions have been inevitable, even in the gaming world. For Crit, it's meant major esports events have been cancelled, and future competitions will likely be held online instead of in person. He won't be able to see his teammates for the foreseeable future either.
It's different now, and I think some people it's harder to adjust to, but I think at some point people will realize that it just has to be this way for a while, and we have to make the best of it. It's obviously not ideal to play online, but we have to be happy that we can at least compete in some way.
Grace Lee, CGTN, Tokyo.
And shifting focus now, here's a look at how commodity markets performed today. Oil prices climbed on the back of a surprising rise in China's April exports, as well as U.S. output cuts and the slow return of some activity in Europe. Brent crude was up 6% at some point, and traders say it is trying to go back to early April levels and stay above $30 a barrel. However, despite this rebound from dire figures in the physical market, a mismatch between demand and supply still remains. Now, gold prices climbed just slightly today. They were spurred on by doubts over recovery in the coronavirus hit global economy. But it is struggling to see decent gains as a strong dollar now dents the precious metals appeal. Well, let's take a short break now. Here's a look at what's coming up. Tunisian engineers launch a campaign to use 3D printing in the fight against COVID-19.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
As 3D printing becomes more accessible than ever, this technology, which seemed reserved for high-tech conglomerates and movies, is now proving its worth in the fight against COVID-19. Now, under the slogan, Makers Against Corona, a group of Tunisian engineers have launched a national campaign to encourage 3D printing. Here's CGTN's Adnan Ashaushi with more.
FabLab is a center for innovation laboratory in the north of the capital city Tunis. Adnan is the executive director of Elspace, a research center which has dedicated its units to 3D printing of face shields for medical staff treating coronavirus patients.
The first step was to identify the needs of the medical staff. We talked to the Tunisian medical staff at the beginning of the pandemic in March. Doctors were scared of the idea of working without protective visors. We designed different models and made them available at COVID-19 units.
The success of the initiative has paved the way for collaborating with factories as well as medium-sized enterprises to produce tens of thousands of face shields and other protective gear.
The designs were made on the computer, then transferred to the third printer, which was worked non-stop for more than 2 weeks to boost production. Now, we're working with industrialists to print more visors at a larger scale to cover the needs of public hospitals.
Following an assessment of the first phase of production, the Tunisian engineers and technicians are now 3D printing other medical equipment which used to be imported from abroad.
We are innovating solutions to counter the spread of the COVID-19 virus and to help the Ministry of Health. The Fab Labs are providing the technical assistance to make new models of face shields, respiratory valves, COVID boxes or intubation boxes. We are prototyping and conceiving new solutions to stop this virus.
In collaboration with 3 Tunisian associations, the Foundation Orange is managing 6 Fab Labs Solidaire to encourage innovation and digital solidarity in the North African state. Health authorities and civil society organizations are providing local innovators with the necessary assistance to tap into the full potential of 3D printing technology during the coronavirus pandemic. Tunisian engineers and technicians now want to make 3D printing accessible to all research units in all regions across the country. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Well, before we go, let's check in on Africa's currencies today. Kenya's shilling was stable against the dollar, supported by inflows from remittances amid weak dollar demand from oil and merchandise importers. Now, traders say the supply counter is more vibrant at the moment, with more dollars coming in, and of course the lack of demand is favoring the shilling. Meanwhile, Nigeria's naira did firm up on the over-the-counter spot and black markets this week. That's after the central bank resumed dollar sales. It was quoted at around 385 to 386 naira per dollar on the spot market, mostly used by foreign investors and exporters. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.